I grew up in a small town called Bellingham, Washington, in the North Puget Sound area, just south of the Canadian border. Being the small town that it was, there was never very much to do, and opportunities for entertainment were few and far between. This became apparent to my family when we moved there when I was 7 years old. The first year of living there was uneventful and dull, but that changed when I stumbled upon the American Museum of Electrical Invention. We walked in, quite by chance, on the account of our favorite restaurant being closed, and I was instantly fascinated by their staggering collection of old radios, televisions, and other old electronics. Looking at it from the outside, you'd never think it was anything special, but once you walk in, you're greeted by a true wonderland of old technology. I was completely hooked after my first visit, and from that point on, I went in there almost every day, as it was only 5 minutes away from our house. I memorized the name and model number of every single electronic device that lined the walls and shelves of that museum, and I would constantly ask the staff to turn on the beautiful old radios so I could hear them receive stations or watch the televisions play old shows. I eventually became good friends with the owner of the museum, John, as well as the co-founder, Tana. That was where I spent most of my childhood, hanging out at that museum. As I got older, I got more into electronics and started helping John restore and repair various old electronics in the repair shop at the back of the museum. I liked this even more because I felt like I was making a contribution to the museum and to preserve such amazing technology. One thing I always wondered about was how such a large collection came to be in such a small town, but as it would turn out, I had only seen a small portion of it. I still clearly remember the day that I saw the basement for the first time. Me and John were sitting at the repair bench doing some work on a radio. It was going well until John removed a part from underneath the chassis and hooked it up to a tester. John cursed under his breath as the tester showed a bad reading. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "This is a very rare part, specific to this radio," he said, unhooking the component from the tester. "Very few were made, so unless we can find a replacement, we've got our work cut out for us." John showed me the part. "See if you can find one that looks like this, and with the same numbers on it," he said, getting out of his chair. We both looked through countless drawers and boxes full of electrical components, but the search turned up empty-handed. We sat back down and contemplated how we would finish the project. "What do we do now then?" I asked. John furrowed his brow and thought. "Well," he began, "it'll be a pain, but we can always go down." "Down?" I asked. I didn't really understand what he meant. "To the basement," he said, getting back up again and walking over to a dark corner of the shop. "Follow me," he said. I got up from my chair and started following him to the corner of the shop that he was walking to. I didn't know what to say. I had been constantly coming here for over 5 years, and I had never been told there was a basement. We stepped over some old boxes and some dusty radio cabinets on the floor until we reached the corner, where there was a door that was partially hidden by a shelf. John opened the door, and we started down a flight of wooden stairs that creaked every step we took. He felt around for a light switch in the near pitch black as we reached the bottom. An array of barely working fluorescent lights flickered on, dimly illuminating the space around us. The walls were bare concrete, and there was tattered red carpet on the floor that looked like it had been there for a very long time. The yellow plaster that the roof is made out of seemed to be falling apart, but that's not what shocked me. What shocked me was how big the basement actually was. There were rows of massive shelves filled with old radios. Not only were they at least 40 feet long, but they were probably 12 feet tall, completely filled to the capacity with radios. I stood in the corner by the stairs, completely awestruck. I looked in one direction, and then the other, and saw that the shelves stretched back as far as the light would reach. I couldn't even see a back wall. My trance was broken when John started walking down a row of shelves, looking up and down as he went. "There might be something down here that we can use," he said. I followed him as we passed row after row of shelves packed with radios, some of which were models I had never seen before. The only sound to be heard were our footsteps and the hum of the fluorescent lights. We walked continuously for about 10 minutes, and my mind started to run wild as I struggled to comprehend just how many radios must have been down here. The place just kept going, like a massive library with endless bookshelves, except it was all old radios. I almost bumped into John as he stopped and bent over to pick up a dusty radio from the bottom of a shelf. He inspected it carefully, turning it over and looking inside. "This might just do it," he said, turning to me with a smile. I glanced in front of him in the direction we had just been walking, and I was even more shocked to see that there was still no sign of a back wall or an end to this place, even after we had walked so far. We started walking back the way we came and eventually reached the stairs again. We walked up and back to the repair shop as John set the radio on the bench and started extracting the part that we needed. For some reason I felt glad not to be in the basement anymore. Don't get me wrong, it was fascinating, but the place just had a weird energy. Something about it didn't really make sense. How big was it really? How many radios were really down there? And why? Question after question flooded my mind, but I'd figure I'd save them for later and worry about the project at hand. We eventually finished the radio we were working on and put it back out on the display floor. I helped John clean up the shop, and after that I went home. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about that basement, but eventually the thoughts drifted from my mind. About 6 months later, my parents and I moved out of Bellingham, and eventually out of Washington State completely. I missed the museum at first, but eventually got into a new routine of life. I got a job and attended tech school and focused on meeting new people. The months turned into years, and I eventually got my own car. I'd almost forgot about the museum until a random article in a magazine got my attention. It was about a house that had been left unchanged since the 40s, and it was like a step back in time. I thought about the museum that I had spent so many happy hours in, and I had an idea. It had been over 6 years since I had been to the museum, so I figured it was about time to take a trip out to Washington to see how the place was doing. Once I had everything ready, I set off. It was about an 8-hour drive from where I lived, so I arrived pretty late in the day, past the time in which the museum closed. I just booked a hotel for the night so I could go to the museum the next day. I got up early the next morning and started driving to the museum, which wasn't too far from the hotel. While on the way, I remembered that basement. How surreal it felt being down there. How there seemed to be no end to it, and how for some reason I had never been told about it. I'd figured I'd have another look down there. After all, it couldn't be that big, right? I was quite young when I originally went down there, so perhaps my young mind had just exaggerated its size. I arrived at the museum and greeted all my old friends at the front desk, and then went to the shop in the back to greet John. While we walked around the museum together, we talked for hours about the times we spent together and the electronics we had worked on. Eventually, I asked him where Tana, the co-founder, was, as I hadn't seen him yet. It had been a very cheerful conversation up until this point, but as soon as I asked about Tana, a look of visible distress washed over John's face. He did his best to hide it, but I knew something was wrong. Tana, he's not here right now, said John. He promptly changed the subject and started talking about a radio he rebuilt. I went along with it, and we talked for maybe another hour before I remembered the basement. Do you remember that time where we couldn't find that rare part we needed, and we had to go to the basement to get a replacement? I asked him. John then gave me a puzzled look and said, I think I remember what you're talking about, but we don't have a basement. What do you mean? I said, taken aback. I remember going down there to try to find that part that we needed. We don't have a basement, said John, more firmly this time. I remember the time you're talking about, he said, but I found that part in a box, not a basement. If this is some sort of joke, it isn't funny, I said, slightly annoyed now. The entrance to the basement was right there, I said, pointing to the dark corner where I remembered the door being. I don't know what you're remembering, but there sure as hell isn't a door there, said John, pointing at the corner. I looked, and he was right. There was no door to be seen, only a set of metal shelves filled with boxes. Maybe you just imagined it or something, but as you can see, there's no basement in this building, and there never has been, said John. He then went to talk to someone at the front desk, and I sat down to collect my thoughts. Perhaps I really did just imagine it, I thought to myself, or perhaps it was all just a dream. All I knew is that I couldn't make any sense of it. I walked over to the corner again and looked at the shelves. Surely that door had been right here. It couldn't have just disappeared. To hell with what John said. I know what I saw. I walked down to the main museum floor and saw John talking to the lady at the front desk. Knowing John, it would be a long conversation. This is my chance, I thought. I ran back into the shop and over to the corner and looked at the shelves again. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed one of the corner shelves and pulled it across the floor. It was extremely heavy, but I eventually managed to pull it out a good distance. I looked behind it, and sure enough, there it was, the door. Its handle had been removed, but it was the same door nonetheless. I put my finger in the hole where the handle used to be and pulled it outwards. It creaked open and the smell of musty carpets filled my nose. Walking down the creaky wooden steps until I reached the bottom. I fell around for the light switch and flicked it on, but nothing happened. Damn it, I muttered to myself. Those lights must have finally given up. I pulled out my phone and turned the flashlight on, illuminating a small area in front of me. I started to walk down one of the rows of the shelves. The last thing I wanted to do was to get lost, so I decided to stay close to the wall and parallel to the stairs. But eventually, mainly due to getting distracted by the radios, I ended up straying away from it. It was exactly as I remembered, endless rows of shelves packed away with radios, like the prophecy room in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I just kept walking onwards and onwards, scanning my phone light from shelf to shelf, constantly impressed by the pristine condition of the radios on them, and occasionally stopping to admire a few. I was so distracted that eventually it dawned on me that I had no idea how long I had been down there. I had no idea how far I walked. Hell, I had no idea where I even was. All I knew is I had been walking away from the stairs, but that was my only clue as to where I was in a colossal space. I stopped walking to get my bearings and shined my phone light in all directions around me. It didn't illuminate much, but as far as I could tell, it was shelves in every direction. It was so faint at first that I thought it was my imagination, but I quieted my breathing and listened closely. I could definitely hear a noise. It seemed to be coming somewhere from the distance and slightly to the left of the direction that I was walking. I couldn't tell what it was, but against my better judgment, I started walking towards it. As I got closer and closer, my gut started to tell me more and more that I should just turn back and leave now while I still had a chance. As I got even closer, I could hear better what the sound was. It sounded distinctly like static. My gut twisted as I rounded the corner of a shelf and saw what was making that noise. It was a radio, and it was on. The light on the dial cast a pale yellow glow in the darkness around it. An empty static blared from its speaker. 1,000 questions ran through my mind at once. Who? What? Why? How? Out here? I realized with a jolt that I didn't see anywhere that I could be plugged in. I was genuinely creeped out and took this as my cue to leave immediately. I started half walking, half jogging down the rows back in the direction I came. I hadn't made it more than 10 feet where once again I stopped. I could hear more static, but this time it was closer. I peeked through a gap in one of the shelves and saw another radio on the adjacent shelf, the same empty static coming out of its speaker. I unconsciously backed away towards the shelf behind me as I started to mentally prepare myself to sprint as fast as I could back to the stairs. But before I could even move, a click and a loud pop of static from right behind my head made me jump out of my skin. I fell to the floor in shock, dropping my phone in the process. I felt around in the dark with shaking hands, and luckily I found it. I got up and looked at the spot where I was just standing to see that there was yet another radio that was on. I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could, but in that moment I was petrified with fear. I started slowly walking backwards as that was the only thing my shaking legs would permit me to do, and as I did so, I started hearing more clicks and more static coming from all directions around me. I continued walking backwards, hearing more clicks and seeing more dial lights cast an eerie yellow glow into the darkness, and all the while this sound of static was getting louder and louder. Suddenly, I heard a much louder click to my left. I jumped in fear and slowly turned my head the direction of the sound, afraid of what I might see. My heart dropped into my stomach as I saw what had made the sound. Every single radio on the shelf next to me was on, the dial lights shining like yellow eyes in the dark. This time I ran. I ran so fast that my feet barely even touched the floor. Don't ask me how I knew, but in that moment I knew that if I didn't get the hell out of there, I would never leave that basement. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't care. I just ran back to the direction of the stairs as fast as my legs could possibly take me, somehow managing to keep a hold of my phone, which was my only source of light. I heard loud clicks follow me as the radios on the shelves behind me turned on in unison, and it was catching up. The more I ran, the closer the clicks got behind me until they were only a row away. My lungs were burning and my legs were about to give out when I caught a glimpse of it in the light on my phone. It was the back wall. the one perpendicular to the stairs. Seeing this, I took on a burst of speed I never knew I had in me, and I practically slammed into it. I turned and ran to the left along the wall, as I knew I would eventually reach the stairs. My body was already starting to give up, and I could feel myself slowing down, but I knew I had to keep going. I risked stealing a glance to my right at the shelves, and saw that every single radio was on. The static was now deafening, and I could only imagine that every single radio in that entire basement was on. I looked back ahead of me and could see that I was only about 5 rows of shelves away from the stairs. It was at that moment that I felt I actually might make it out. I was about 20 feet away from the stairs when it happened. I noticed the static got quieter all of a sudden, and then I heard it. A voice. It was a deafeningly loud, screaming voice, distorted and static, and it came out the speaker of every single radio in that entire basement.
Help me.
I scrambled up the stairs like a frantic little kid and slammed the door as hard as I could. I didn't stop and rest until I had pushed those metal shelves back in front of the door. I fell down to the floor and struggled to fill my burning lungs with oxygen. I eventually sat down in a chair and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but my mind drew a blank. There was just no explanation to any of it. The seemingly never-ending basement, the radios turning on by themselves, or that horrifying voice I heard coming out of them. "Hey, are you okay? I thought I heard the door slam back there," said John as he walked into the back of the shop. He gave me a worried look as I tried to get my breathing under control. I debated whether or not to tell him what had just happened, but I ended up telling him the whole story. I expected him not to believe me, but when I finished, he just sat there and stared at the wall. He had gone pale, like he had seen a ghost, and his hands were shaking. "John, are you okay?" I asked him, putting my hand on his shoulder. "It happened last year," said John, finally speaking. "Tana was up here in the shop working on something. We needed a part and had to go down to the basement to find it. I was conducting a guided tour, and I didn't notice he hadn't come up until it was time to close the museum for the night." "You mean to say," I began. "Just to be sure, we checked on the security cameras, and they clearly showed him going down, but never coming back up. Of course, we went back down there to look for him, but when we went down, we noticed the lights didn't work. I remember we all felt like we needed to get out of that basement, but we couldn't put our finger on it. After that, we got the police involved, but he was never found. He just disappeared without a trace down there. That's why I hid the door and started telling people there wasn't a basement at all. Hell, the newer staff don't even know to begin with, and it's gonna stay that way. What is that place? How is it so big? I don't understand it," I asked him frantically. "If I knew, I'd tell you. It was built long before this place became the museum it is now, and the shelves were already there. We had a lot of connections back then, and to be honest, we acquired way more radios than we needed through donations and the like, so we just put them all down there. The weird part is," he said, lowering his voice a little, "I don't remember it being very big when we originally put the radios down there. It seemed to get a little bigger every time one of us went down, until eventually it seemed endless." We sat in silence, not saying anything after that. After about 10 minutes, he looked at his watch and said, "We better close up." I said goodbye to John and my friends and drove back to the hotel. The incident and the story John told me is still fresh in my mind. I've been back to that museum only once since that incident took place, and I was happy to see that the entrance to that hellish basement had been completely sealed up. Just a plain white wall was left where the door used to be. Me and John never talk about what happened, and if anyone asks about Tana, we just say he died in a car crash. I still think about that day all the time, and I still can't make any sense of it, but one thing's for sure, that basement is some kind of an anomaly, and Tana was its first victim. I firmly believe that if I hadn't made it to those steps when I did, I would have been next. Hey guys, thanks for watching tonight's video. I'd also like to thank Destroid777 for letting me narrate this story. This is definitely one of my new favorite stories on the channel, and you can find more of her work by clicking the link down in the description below. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. That's all for now. See you guys next time. Good night.